Hi everyone, this is Allan McKay. So welcome to the very first ever visual effects case study. So I'm going to be deconstructing the visual effects sequences from the movie Venom. And I'm really excited for this as this is going to be the very first one of many that I'm going to be going through. And it's more from the perspective of a visual effects supervisor breaking down the sequences and how they would be approached. I think this is going to be very unique, very fun, and I can't wait to get started. So that being said, let's dive in. Hi everyone, this is Allan McKay. So I wanted to welcome you to this brand new series of videos that I'm going to be putting out pretty regularly, which is the visual effects case study. So just a quick introduction to how this is going to work. I do a lot of public speaking, and usually when I'm doing a masterclass at SIGGRAPH or something like that, there's been a lot of times where I'll go on stage and I'll talk about a movie that I've worked on and deconstruct the process of what we did. And I thought this is really fun to do, and on top of that, I'm doing a lot of live reviews with my students where every 2 weeks I critique their work inside of my courses, give them feedback, answer their questions, and really help improve their work for the next iteration. Exactly how, as a visual effects supervisor, I do in dailies every day during production. I review everyone's work, I tell them what that needs to change, what the director wants, and I problem solve with them what needs to get done. And each day we revise it, we review it, we revise it, and we improve on it until the shots get finalized. Now, what I thought would be interesting is to do that for other people's work instead. So what I wanted to do is start to tackle individual movies and go through key sequences in the film and kind of deconstruct what's going on, how I would personally approach it, and more importantly, doing it from the perspective of someone who didn't necessarily work on the film. And I think that is kind of interesting because, again, as a supervisor, I'll get given treatments, I'll get given scripts, and I'll need to break down sequences, how long I think they're going to take, what's going to be involved, all of these things. And so it's important to do that having no technical knowledge about the actual shots because it's all ahead of time. It's more looking at it with just the bare bones information and trying to deconstruct it all. So that being said, I think it's important to say that what I say in these sequences isn't necessarily how it was done. It's more my opinion of it or how I would approach it. Usually what happens is I might look at a script and say, okay, I think we're going to need 6 weeks for the 3D, and I also think that we need an additional 2 weeks for comp. We're going to need to go and create some UI elements over here, and it's another 2 weeks. Bit by bit, go through it all, but the people actually sitting down and having to do it are the ones that are going to go with the direction that they think is right. Okay, so even if I say, go and animate a fully procedural solution for a vehicle crashing into a wall, someone might realize, you know what, we're gonna have to hand animate it and brute force it the whole way through. So I just want to point that out, that what I say doesn't necessarily mean that that's how it was done. It's me more looking at it from the 30,000 foot view, how I think I would approach it with a team, given the fact that I'm not in there doing it. Okay, so that's always critical, again, because in hindsight, it's very easy to say, well, this is the solution we did. But again, ahead of time, you're more looking at the bare bones of how to approach things. So this is going to be a lot of fun. This is something that I want to do more regularly. I'm going to do it potentially every single month. I'm going to release a different movie. I'm going to go through how to do the visual effects for it, what's involved, all of this stuff. And it's always work in progress. Just like my podcast, when I first released it, obviously it takes a while to get into the habit with it. So just because I'm doing things one way, it doesn't mean that I might improve upon this process and maybe get more technical, maybe talk more about the bidding or more about the management perspective. I'm always open to ideas, and I think that it's going to be really fun to go through this. Now, a little bit about me and why I'm doing this. I'm a visual effects supervisor. I've been working for 20-something years in visual effects. I've worked on everything from Game of Thrones to Transformers to Superman to Star Trek, the new Avengers Endgame. I've got some stuff going on with that. I work on a lot of different things, and I work both as a studio owner, a visual effects supervisor. I work on the box when I can. I also have a podcast, which you'll see regularly in the top 200 podcasts in the career section of iTunes. I have my mentorship that I run every year, and a lot of students then go on to ILM and Weta and Scanline and MPC and Framestore, Atomic Fiction, a lot of key studios from there. I worked on a lot of video games, Half-Life, Call of Duty, Destiny, Halo, I don't know, Bioshock, a lot of stuff. So, I tend to stay pretty busy. I work on a lot of big projects. I like doing small projects. I like working with small teams when I can. But, obviously I run a couple of companies. I've got a lot of stuff going on. And I think it's important to mention that. Just again, it's good to know the roots of, who's talking and what kind of background they have. So I think it's important to say that day in, day out, I work as a visual effects supervisor, but I also come from being on the box. So I know, a lot of this stuff too, just because I think, again, it's important to kind of know both spectrums of that. Like I said, this is the first one, which is Venom, and I'm excited to go through this. This was part of a visual effects crash course I did recently, where I put out, in the end, it was about 10 hours of free visual effects training, creating a lot of sequences, simulating drool, the tendrils and tentacles, and everything else. It was a lot of fun, and I wanted to introduce the visual effects case study that way. I only put it out for about 2 weeks, and about 60,000 people piled into it and did all the training. It was a lot of fun. And so now what I'm doing is I'm releasing this as a standalone lesson on YouTube, but this is going to be the first of many. So what I want to do next is I'm going to be releasing, I want to do Infinity War, Kong, a couple other projects, and then, again, I love this to get your feedback on what you want to see, what the structure is like. I have gotten some feedback from people. It's very subjective feedback, but some people are saying like, I wish it was more technical. We get very technical into this. It's very much from a supervisor's point of view, but I'm going through how I would do things in 3D. In fact, I get very technical in this. So I feel like that's why I say it's interpretive. I feel like a few people, the one or two people I did see say make it more technical, I think what they were really trying to communicate is go into 3D and show me how to make these shots. Funnily enough, that's what I'm doing with a lot of the training that I'm putting out as well. So, this isn't that. This is me showing you from a perspective that I don't think anyone ever gets to see, how I would approach these sequences and do them as at a studio. Again, I've worked at ILM and, Blur, a lot of really big visual effects facilities. I've consulted with pretty much every big facility out there. So, whether it's a big or small place, like these are the steps that would be involved. So that being said, showing you how to create the visual effects, I actually do a lot of that. Okay, so I'm pointing that out that in the past year, I've put out over 100 hours of training. It's typically to my private email list, and that's just my way of rewarding people to take action and go through it. If you want to get on that, allanmckay.com/inside to sign up. It's free. I typically do it there. I release a lot of free training, but that's just my way of saying, like, look, take action, go through the training rather than, just browsing around, clicking on stuff, because that's not how you learn. That's not how you retain information, and it's definitely not how you grow at a rapid pace. But yeah, I definitely show the how-to, but this is different. This is definitely more from the perspective of a supervisor rather than as an artist teaching how to click all the buttons to do, a certain effect. So I wanted to do a bit of a long intro here just to kind of really clarify a few things and set the tone. I'm excited for this. I think this was a lot of fun, and I want to do more of these. I'm hoping this is something that you find valuable, and you don't need to be in 3D to find this valuable. You could be a compositor. You could be just someone who enjoys film and wants to know more behind the scenes, but really the nitty-gritty, not the fluffy, fun featurettes and things like that. So whatever department you're in, or if you're not in visual effects at all, this I think is going to be a lot of fun and hopefully very insightful, because it's specifically from the perspective of production, okay, from post-production. So that being said, let's get into the very first visual effects case study, which is on Venom. Okay, really quick. Yes, the beard is gone. I've been trying to put this video up for a week, and I knew before I even started the biggest obstacle would be if this is going to go on YouTube, that copyright issues are going to plague me everywhere, and I've got to be careful about that. So I'd done some initial testing in the very beginning, and everything seemed to be working fine. So I went and made the video, and now I'm running into some hiccups. So this has been a bit of a journey, and I think it's specifically because this is a Sony copyrighted material that I've just got to be very careful with how much material I'm going through at any given time. It's been a learning journey, but unfortunately I have had to trim things down in certain areas, and rather than playing video all the way through, I have to make it more freeze frame here and there. So I'm just going to mention this ahead of time that the end sequence I had to trim down a little bit and a couple other areas like that. In general, episode 1 of anything, there's always going to be bumps. But I just want to mention this ahead of time. If you want to see the full, unedited, complete, director's cut, whatever thing, I've got it up on Vimeo, and I'll put a link in the description. But otherwise, in general, in the future, I'm going to design these with the intent that they'll be YouTube friendly. But this time around, I definitely went through some struggles, and yeah, so just a heads up about that this is slightly modified down, but you're not missing out on anything really. But obviously with Vimeo, I was able to show the full sequences with sound of each of the sequences we tackle, and then I was able to play through and scrub through a lot more content as well. So it's kind of frustrating, but I just wanted to bring that up ahead of time. Okay, let's get in there. Okay, so going through this, first shot here, we just have like a CG ship. We have like some atmosphere trails like dragging behind, and then like embers coming off, like pretty basic setup. And then you have a matte painting, which would be projected onto geometry potentially here. So one of these, like I've done maybe a couple of dozen of these types of shots before. Obviously, it ramps up. So initially it's establishing the shot, and then you start to see a lot more happening towards the end to kind of indicate, oh wait, like what's up? Instead of just here's a ship, then it's like, oh wait, like is there something going on? Like is there something wrong? And then it cuts to here where we start to see it deteriorate more. The shot itself, like again, like I want to make it clear, like I don't want to pick on any shots in this too much. Like I do feel like with this whole movie, I feel like there was a bit of a budget and schedule was pretty tight. I could be wrong about that, but just in general, like I do feel like there's a lot of stuff like this that I'll talk about, but like I do feel like there was some cases where they were taking the easy route. So that being said, I do feel like a lot of the particles coming off are just kind of appearing out of nowhere. There is a little bit of stuff breaking off, it feels like here, but in general, they're just kind of like appearing out of nowhere. Usually the way you do a shot like this is kind of interesting because I feel like creatively, if you're moving this quick, you should have a lot more atmosphere like moving quicker. The atmosphere moving past the camera is so slow considering how quick you're moving. This stuff should be whipping by, it should be very staccato. So it's kind of interesting doing shots like this though, because usually what happens is you have your camera and this is your field of view. So because of that, the camera's whipping by really quick. So it's meant to be an arrow really quick. And you have your ship doing the same thing. So it's moving really quick too. So the two are pulling back really quickly. And so as you're doing that, as you've got your camera and you've got your ship and both of them are moving down like that, usually what you'll do is you'll populate clouds of atmosphere all around it. And as the camera whips by, it's going to pull right through those clouds, and you're going to have a lot of these everywhere. And because you got such a big open space, there's no point of reference. It's not like you got like if this was the camera on the side, it's not like you got foreground, midground, background. So you got any perspective or parallax. You don't have any of that. So because of that, it's really important to have all this atmosphere just whipping by really quick, to give some kind of point of reference that you actually are moving. Otherwise, it just feels like you're very stationary. And that's what's happening in the shot with the atmosphere. It's gradually moving back. So I personally feel like the camera should be whipping back way quicker than it currently is, considering that this is meant to be moving so quickly through the atmosphere. But what is interesting is when you're doing a shot like this, I've done so many of these, usually you're going to have your camera and you're going to have the ship. And if you look at it, like if you pull the view right back, it's literally going to be a tube of like all your atmosphere. You're going to have like all these puffs of cloud everywhere. And there's nothing outside of there, because obviously if you were to do 360 degrees, like that's a lot of atmosphere to distribute. And it also can look kind of weird, really far back when you see it all kind of further away. But having just that more what's in your field of view as the camera's moving through, it just means that all this stuff whips by really quick, and it gives that sense of motion. But yeah, it's usually constrained to that tube, which is kind of funny just to look at it outside of there. It's very non-elegant. The other thing about this is usually the way you approach doing stuff like this is you'll have like a very defined flame. And this is, the flame coming in from, re-entering the atmosphere. And again, usually, depending on the ship, you might have like some block on the front to stand most of the heat and resistance. But anyway, with this, to get that defined flame, it's kind of interesting because I've done this so many times. Usually what you'll end up doing is you've got your ship, you've got all your atmosphere, you've got your particles whipping by. That's all done in your master scene. But then what I would typically do is I would then get my my ship, and I would save it as a separate file and create like a simulation scene specifically for the atmosphere re-entry flames, because these need to be very defined, and it needs to be moving very quickly. And you got to keep in mind that this ship's, I'd assume it's like 1,000 miles an hour. I mean, if a plane goes at 500 miles an hour, then I'd assume that. So, this is moving very quickly. If you're doing this in 3D space, like if you were to sim, this is frame 1, this is frame 3, that's frame 2. If you were to sim a ship flying that quickly, you're going to need to sim like a lot of subframes to get an accurate sim of this. So you'd probably sim like 100 frames for every one frame, or 100 samples per every one frame. So that gets messy very quickly. It's very slow. So anytime you've got fast moving objects or fast moving camera or things reacting to a fluid sim, that's where it gets tricky, just because you need it to still stay defined and be able to keep up with it all without simulating lots of mass frames. So that's why I would export this out, and then if you have your ship flying that way or whatever, usually I would either kill off all the animation altogether, or I would restrict how far it flies. So it doesn't fly all the way out there, it only flies to here. And by doing that, it means that now the motion isn't like jumping through 3D space as much, and it means it's a lot more gradual, and I can start to simulate some nice fire or whatever on it. So that's most of the time, this is what you'll do for getting really defined fire explosions. Like if a jet got hit by a rocket, some of the explosions you might simulate separately to be able to get all that definition in there. And so what you would do is you would simulate all of this, and it would usually be like, here's the ship. You would have a particle emitter shooting out particles in either direction. You would set the turbulence to be very low levels, in other words, like low frequency. So that way, instead of getting like really intricate flames like so, instead you would get more wavy kind of flames. And so by doing that, it's lower octaves, it'll be more friendly. It's not going to be as detailed, but that's the sort of look that you're going for, rather than this high frequency kind of, paper burning or something like that. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense. But like, something like this, I would do a lock off shot. So the ship is just moving a little bit, and then I would simulate, fire burning over it all. And then what I would do is I would export that finished simulation back into the master file, and I would parent it onto the ship. And so that simulated flame would be parented on it, so that way it's rolling over it, it's interacting correctly, but it didn't need to be simulated over 100 miles or whatever is in the shot. And so that sort of thing you would do quite often. Another way to do it is also like you you have your XYZ animation, let's say it is moving in that direction, you can always parent a dummy. Let's just say I parent like a locator or something here, and I copy the animation over and I reverse it just for that one axis. So I'm getting more complicated here, but like Flight with Denzel Washington, that Zemeckis film, for that one I did, I worked on the big plane crash and the rest of the film too, but with that, I kept all the rotation for left and right, back and forth with the engines, but then distance-wise, what I did is I copied the animation over, I reversed it, so then this guy is going this way, but I parented this to here, so that way the motion's going this way, but this one's going that way, but not as much. So this one kind of gradually just moves forward a little bit there, but technically, all of that is moving correctly in physical space. It sounds complicated, and also the camera was doing the same thing, but it meant that I had like a lock-off shot that I could do all my effects in, and then put them back into the final file. So there's a lot of stuff like that you can do to pull off this sort of stuff, but that's usually what you would end up doing. So, but like I said, like it's mainly to do with the fact that it's having to travel so far that you would need to sim more samples to get an accurate sim, and it's overkill. It's not practical, so that's why you would do that setup. Now, in the following shot here, and again, I like how all this looks. I think it's really cool. I'm just more kind of talking about the process. But this shot here is a wide shot, so it's kind of tricky because you're going to have this ship flying and covering a lot of distance. So there's a few things to think about. Like the good thing is you're far away, so it doesn't matter too much. But it's obviously moving very quickly in context of what it's doing. So usually something like this, what I would do is because you want to get like a nice trail of fire and smoke that's consistent. So I would usually look dev a section and make sure it's looking good, and then from there I would create either script it or just do it manually. But I'll create a lot of overlapping shapes of your grid, whether it's Pyro Effects and Houdini or Fume Effects or whatever you want to do. And all these grids would overlap slightly, but I would run them all so that way the ship, as it flies through all those grids, it's simulating all of it. So rather than doing like one big grid, I would probably do smaller grids. I tend to do that quite a lot. It just means I can get a lot of detail, and because I'm really tight in on one section that way, and that works out really well. So as this comes in, it starts to go more into the foreground. This entire shot I would assume is CG, depending on like where it's done. I know this is all DNEG for the most part, but ILM, for instance, their Digimat department does it all in 3ds Max. They render out in Arnold. Starting to use Clarice for a lot of stuff too, but something like this shot here, if it was, I'm just saying hypothetically, ILM, this would always be entirely digital. The effects would either be in Max using thinking particles and Fume Effects, or in Houdini using Pyro Effects, depending on which one. Like San Francisco, the headquarters of ILM, does a lot of Houdini and does a lot of Max as well, like 3ds Max, whereas like Vancouver is more Houdini. So it just depends on which shop, but headquarters is still Max and Houdini. And obviously this is DNEG, but I would assume like it would be pointless to do a shot like this live action. Obviously you get a lot of this for free because you just shoot it all, but the tricky thing is that a lot of the foreground environment is going to get destroyed, so why not just do it all entirely CG? So I think that's the approach that they've gone for. But overall this looks really cool. Otherwise you'd mask it off and just make this section here CG. But the only things that I do want to bring up is, just like I was saying before, if you got a lot of fast moving stuff, you need to do your simulations a lot tighter. So I feel like in this case, maybe they're like really big grids. And so because of that, the voxel grids are too big. So in other words, like what I'm looking at is there's a lot of gaps you'll see in the fluid sims. And I see this quite a lot throughout this. So if we go back a little bit, as this comes in, this is very fast moving, but you can already see it a little bit in the beginning. You can kind of see there's a lot of steppiness, and what that is it's basically It's kind of subtle, but you can see it all there. And what that is this needs to be simulated with more samples per frame. So as we step through this, you can see there's a lot of repetition, and that's because, as I was saying before, where you're 1, 2, 3, if it's got to jump from there to there to there, there's going to be a lot of gap in the middle that wasn't simmed. So that's where you usually need to sub-sim more frames to make it more consistent. Otherwise, you end up getting blob, 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 blob all the way around, and that's kind of what we're getting here, is all these blobs. So as we get closer, it's a lot more obvious, but that's just, I don't want to pick on these shots, but it's just one thing that, because I review this stuff every day, it's just, for me, it's just like, oh man, that could be fixed, just throw more cycles at it. So you can see here, you got blob, 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 blob. So that's because that's a frame, that's a frame, that's a frame. So there's a lot of inconsistency there, and that kind of continues through. So again, I would hate for anyone to pick apart my work frame by frame. So I'm always going to be sympathetic there. But again, it's just one of those things that you can see that this needed more sims, and that's kind of consistent with what I'm about to go further into. So it's just stuff like this that I feel like there's been a bit of this in this film where there could have been 1 or 2 more versions before it got finaled, and they kind of like got good enough, and then they got finaled. So you can see a lot of that. Obviously, the camera motion blur kind of helps cover it up a little bit, but you can see all that kind of steppiness going through there. The other thing is, like, when you're working on a shot like this, whenever I'm reviewing stuff, like, I might see little errors and things like that, and like there, but it's not a big deal because it's a fast shot and my eye is focused here, so that's fine. However, as this ship comes down, and it's not too obvious, but the ship is here, your eye starts to shift focus to that because it's moving to the foreground, and it's moving faster than everything else. That's fine, but a lot of this fire, again, is just, it's very blobby, low res, considering that it's a foreground element, and it's also one of the first shots in the film. So that's where I would definitely up-res some of this stuff, just because you're getting so close to it. But again, like, if we look at the trails here, this is the stuff that, for me personally, like, I think it's really important to have small things like this. It really emphasizes the scale of the explosion when you can have smaller stuff kind of breaking out of it. But you'll see a lot of this where flame, 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 they're all broken up, and that's because, again, it just wasn't sampled enough times. So that's why I feel like, either they just did like a really big grid, and so therefore it isn't able to sample everything enough times to get a good result. However that might be, but like, there's a lot of that. So there's a lot of really blobby, not very detailed flame trails. And then on top of that, you can see the repetition all the way through, just because, and the breakup, just because I don't feel like these were sampled enough times. And that's fine. It's just one of those things that, like, for me, I'm going to do my hero explosion. It's probably going to be a couple of grids built together to make one big one. Stuff like this, though, I would just write a little script to generate those grids again, like I mentioned before, because rather than having a really big grid where everything is being covered inside of there and it can't get that detail that you want, I would just say, okay, here are my trajectories. I would write a script that just quickly builds a few grids, or even just one big one specific to that trail. It sounds kind of overkill, like, well, if you do that, that might be like 40 grids. But you fire them out to the farm, and they're like 20 minutes per sim per piece. It ends up being a couple of hours to do the whole thing, rather than a couple of days just to do like a really big sim, and you're going to get a lot more detail from it. You can run a lot more samples on it. You get a lot more intricate flame. Like, a lot of this will be consistent. So that's the sort of thing for me. Is just like I build it all out where I'm going to get a lot of detail from it, and you're just not going to get like the blobs and that inconsistency where it's kind of like it kind of turns on and off. just like big gaps everywhere, stuff like that. So that's the main thing, is just introducing detail. This is one of the first shots in the film, so it's always really important to kind of set that tone. And especially, like I said, some of the foreground stuff as this comes in, I would just try to introduce more detail where you can, just because your eye shifts to it. It's also closer up than everything else, so you would expect to see more detail rather than being too blobby. So again, not being mean, it's just those are the things that I'm always going to comment on. I think it's really important. All of this stuff here is obviously practical. I like that they introduced this drone here just because it's consistent with later in the movie where they have a ridiculous drone sequence. So having one in there just kind of like ties it together. What I imagine is like this part here, that could be practical. I think that is probably not in this case, but that's all in matte painting. It's the only wide shot of this ship. So therefore you have your establishing shots. So you can see like, okay, crash site, there's the ship. And then from there, you just cut to the prop and you just focus on that piece for the rest of it. So you don't really get to see the rest of the ship. So, and that's fine. So you see all the anamorphic lens flares here. There's some that are artificial and they kind of stand out like a sore thumb, but these are fine. These are obviously all practical smoke and everything else. I like all this kind of stuff because you get a lot of things for free. So in other words, all that light, volumetric lighting kind of pushing through the foliage. That sort of stuff, like, you don't get in CG unless someone specifically requests it. So obviously you get it automatically when it's all in frame. So, I think that's really cool having stuff like that in there. So with this canister here, I'm not sure how much of this is CG. I would assume that, all of this whole thing is all practical. And then this section, like the glass, is basically all CG. And then, obviously you've got the symbiote suit sitting in the center here, doing its thing. So usually you would just have some tracking markers, or potentially you probably track these to get a stable track even, but you probably have some tracking markers in there purely to lock in the object track, and that way you can have that in there, and you do the glass and everything in CG. I thought I'd just cut right into here. So these are all screen burn-ins. So back in the day, back in the 90s, you would have like CRT monitors and you'd have like all that kind of essentially rolling shutter in a way on the screens. And, it's very distracting just because the way that the screens would refresh is it's rolling constantly down. And meanwhile, our cameras are trying to capture all that. It's out of sync, so it doesn't really work. So LCD screens, you don't need to do that anymore. So sometimes when you're working on set, they've already planned ahead and they've put stuff on the screens. So, back in the day, these would all be green screens, and you would have giant tracking markers on all of these. And the main thing is, so you could just easily do a corner pin and sit something in screen. So all of these would be green with some tracking markers. And then, you just do a corner pin for all of them. And, a lot of studios, they would make a living doing that. They would just be dedicated to doing all the screen burn-ins. There's studios like Banned from the Ranch, which was, these guys are working for ILM, Skywalker Ranch. They got fired. They created Banned from the Ranch, which they kind of almost exclusively did like most of the industry's screen burn-ins for everything. And it's kind of interesting seeing all that because, like, whatever you could think of, like they were working on that stuff, just doing mass amounts of that. These days, like I said, there are times where they might bring a motion graphics artist on to already build all this stuff out before they shoot it, and then they just put it on the screen, like they actually put it on literally on the screen and film it, and that way they don't have to do anything. But it's still really common just to do screen burn-ins. So I would imagine these are all green screens with tracking markers. There's actually a lot of screens, so as this kind of pans across and then pulls back a little bit, you can see that like these are all probably green screens with tracking markers. That there would just be a giant screen. I'm assuming this is a soundstage, so that is probably a screen as well. And the background environment is all comped in. So all of this, I imagine, is just a lot of comp work. So now we'll move on to the second part of the sequence, and I'll play that through. Okay, so just jumping into this, usually I would say that this is a live action shot, and that's a live action shot there. Given the fact that I think there's only like 5 ambulance shots in this sequence, and I feel at least 3 of them are CG, I'm guessing that probably all are CG. And again, like I feel it's pretty good these days, the fact that it isn't like obvious. I can't say like, oh yeah, that's CG, or that environment is CG. I think it's really cool that we are at a point where, if I really want to scrutinize things, I could probably, pick it apart and say, oh yeah, definitely CG or whatever. But in general, I feel like, as long as you're doing a good job, like most of the time, shots can be pretty indistinguishable. So I think that's pretty cool. So I'm not sure. This could be live action, could be CG. If it is CG, it's pretty impressive. Obviously, it's easy because it's hazed and there's a lot of lighting covering everything up. But I'm only opting for that because I feel like otherwise it's going to overkill to do a sequence like that, even if it's just second unit, if it's only for a couple of shots. Because like that there, I would assume is live action too. But then this shot here, it could be live action doing the flip, but then from here, these are all CG. And it's okay. There's nothing bad about it. It's just the animation is very mechanical. It's not very good. And I can understand why. Like I understand the creative direction would be like it needs to end exactly here on this frame. But it could have been a lot more organic and natural, like sliding into place rather than just like stop. Because it's I wouldn't imagine that. So all of this though, I'd say is all CG, and then this here, I'd assume the way they shot this is they had the woman, the talent here, literally just kind of mimic peeling everything away and walking through all of it, just because the camera is moving. So I'm imagining she's actually in frame in this. It isn't comped. I could be wrong. But yeah, all the metal bending and everything like that. Like the way I would do something like that is I would just cut all of the metal and then set up some wrap deformers. So if you're in Maya, wrap deformers, if you're in, let's say, Max, skin wrap, you can get some really great results just kind of like cutting up all the metal, doing all the texturing, everything for that, but then manually peeling it all away using custom objects to rig the metal bending and buckling. Just to get that kind of look. So it's not very hard to do that sort of stuff. I've done a lot of it. And then finally, this here, I'd imagine her leg is just a green stocking, underneath there, possibly with tracking markers. Where's her knee? I guess her knee is there. So I'd assume there's tracking markers rather than trying to eyeball it. But I mean, ideally, you just need 3 points because you just need the knee joint. I'm assuming that's the knee. You just need the knee joint in there just to kind of match move that. But either way, this is all 3D in here. And then obviously it kind of goes into place there. And then, that's all just CG. And that's pretty much it. So I'm going to try to go through this as quick as I can. Again, I feel like Venom is one of those. It's going to be an interesting one to do, just because the effects are kind of all over the place in a lot of ways. Like the effects are cool. Like I really enjoy seeing what they've done in this film. But again, it feels like there's been a lot of people who've been kind of thrown at this, and because of that, there's some inconsistencies. But hey, it works. It's a fun film, and I'm sure the budget isn't like massive for this. But yeah, so let's move on to the next sequence. Okay, so let's just jump through this. Going through the shot here, again, we got screen burn-ins, got cool gooey stuff. All of this, I imagine, is done in post rather than on camera. Now, again, I don't know how much of this is practical and how much of this is CG. If I were to guess, I would actually imagine the entire thing is CG. just because I love the texturing, I'm more kind of just assuming that with all the edges being kind of brushed off, and it's just very easy to kind of go overboard with this stuff in CG. And again, I've seen it done on set with practical elements, things like that too. But that's just my guess, would be that all this is CG. And again, I could be wrong. Either way, you got all the schmutz on the glass here, all the animation. This is I would imagine all CG inside of here, and then obviously the symbiote. So overall, I don't know the rig for the symbiote, like how specifically it's being done. I'd assume it's some sort of rig, spline IK, something like that, for the main part. And then underneath there's a lot of procedural stuff going on. So it's all hand animated for the key part, but then all of this is an implicit surface. You've got, areas like arms essentially that come out. And what I imagine is happening, you'll see it in the other shots, is like if this is the ground, you'd have an arm, coming down. What would happen is around here, it would fire out like a distance ray and say, okay, like we're that far from the ground. So suddenly you would see, this section, and it would split off into multiple arms, and they would come in contact with the ground. So wherever it goes, if this was the wall, those would instantly kind of snap to the ground and then move around. And on top of that, we'll get into it more in a moment, but like it would create like an interaction layer of liquid underneath as well. That's not fluid, but it just kind of gives it that interaction that I was talking about. Because I think with a lot of these effects, what's going on is you want this all to tie in really easily to the environment. So you had that one woman with the fingers going across the face, and as they were interacting, you would see the veins kind of bleeding out into the face, or growing out into the face, and that would kind of give it that layer of interaction around it, so that way it didn't just feel like it's sitting on top. And it's the same thing, like when you have the floor, especially when it's reflective, that stuff kind of throws everything off. So if you then have like the symbiote on the ground, it's always going to sit feeling very floaty. So having something that's directly interacting and navigating on the ground, and on top of that having this layer of liquid underneath, all of those things will help integrate it and make it feel like it sits better in the shot. So whether it's on humans or anything else, you'll see also there's that one bit where it kind of splits off. That's really cool. And again, hand animated, but that's the sort of thing just to kind of make it feel like it's got more character. Little subtle things like that can really be effective when you're introducing something like this, to kind of say like, okay, like this isn't just some like blobby undulating thing. It actually has purpose. So it's more of a story driver, but it's really good. Again, you can kind of see as this breaks off, you got the key interactions here where it's wrapping around. I think certain things like this are more controlled, and that's actually one thing. I won't go on like a big tangent, but one thing with film versus like doing 3D in general, like whenever I get called on stage, Autodesk or whoever's getting me to speak at the time, they will love for me to do these like I'm doing air quotes, procedural effects. So like, no keyframes, the whole thing is all automatically animated. And that sounds great in theory. Like that's, what we always love to show off because it's exciting, it's interesting. But when you work on a shot, you don't build this elaborate thing where you've literally built yourself out of having any control. And that's something that's so common with more junior effects artists, is that they'll go and try and make something super complicated and super cool, and it's cool at lunchtime because you can brag to your friends about what you've done. But as soon as the director says, okay, I just want you to do this one thing, you're like, like I can't do that, like it won't allow me to do it, because it's all procedural. So a lot of time, like feature films are, it's on a shot-by-shot basis. There's so many hacks and so many things to go on because you need complete control. You need to bend and break things as you go. It's good to have procedural control where you can get away with it as an afterthought, but there's still going to be specific shots that you might want to get additional controls in there. So, for instance, I feel like a lot of the kind of snapping to the surface that goes on here, I feel like that it all is procedural. But then I feel like in shots like this, perhaps like they're a little bit more controlled than usual. And again, I could be wrong, but I love, you know, how this works. I really love what they did with the symbiote suit. The free training I put out for Venom recently, originally I was going to, I was actually going to be animating it myself before Lucas Ridley jumped on to help out. Thank you again, Lucas. And with that, I wanted to work within my limitations because I'm not a character animator. I have animated characters for Max Steel and a few other TV shows back in the day, but, you know, I'm not going to be able to give a good performance. So I need to work within my limitations. So I was originally going to animate the symbiote kind of crawling on the ground, and they would transform and do some cool stuff, but it was typically going to be more upper body animation of Venom and the symbiote, which would be a lot more kind of articulated fem simulations in Houdini or in Max, rather than, you know, going for a very character animated, you know, driven animation. So I'm grateful that Lucas came on because it gave so much more freedom to what we're doing. So again, as this moves down, you can see that it's interacting and creating, you know, all of these layers of interaction. So this is kind of like, I'd assume it's particles, but you could do it as masking with textures as well. You know, it isn't something that I feel is doing any fluid simulation. It's just purely a distance blend. So in other words, as you have these arms kind of come down and interact with something, it would create kind of a splash decal around that area. So all of this again is you know, implicit shape. So all of it kind of metaballs together, but what it's really doing is it's saying that this is the symbiote. And for him not to be just sitting on top of everything, as with a lot of the effects in Venom, there's that layer of interaction, whether it's the texture map on that girl's face of the veins, or in this case, it's more 3D, but it's still that layer of interaction that ties it together. And so I like what they've done. I think it works really well. There's a few shots with the cloth, like when you'll see it on this guy's chest. I'm not a big fan of it. But in general, I think that it works really well here, and it's very necessary. So as you see it comes down, same thing, you get all these kind of spilt out splines. I'm assuming it's kind of like a rope simulation. It's kind of more a driven rope simulation, but it's looking for a surface, it attaches to it, and then there's that layer, you know, of dumb particles that are more there as an interaction with it all. So, like I said, I don't think it's fluid or anything. It's just a layer that's specifically there just to work with that. But yeah, I really like what they've done. I think this would have been so fun to work on. So in the trailer, it stops there, which just looks really weird placing. So it makes more sense when he actually crawls up to his face. And again, like, this is so cool. I love the whole design of this, like all the splines and everything else. Like, I feel like it's basically a lot of splines and surfacing on top, and all of this kind of metaballs together, and it's more all the secondary procedural motion that kind of ties it all together. So yeah, I think it's really cool. But as you can see, we have that layer to make it feel like it's interacting with the cloth. Because again, if you couldn't see it, if it was just the CG character sitting on him, it's always going to look a little bit floaty. But this is the only time, like, I'm not a big fan of the cloth stuff. Like, I feel almost like as if it's like a 2D mask. I realize it's not. I'd assume it's a texture map, and obviously it's meant to feel like it's wet, it's damp. But yeah, I don't know. I always think of, like, even at 2K, there's all the subtle detail to the cotton, and I just feel like it gets lost in that stuff. I don't know why I'm picky about that, but it's just, it feels just very, you know, very much a mask rather than, you know, trying to do like wet cloth or something like that, which could be kind of cool. But yeah, so I mean, in general, like I said, I'm just not a big fan of that wet kind of cloth feel. Just, it feels very comped on. More screen burn-ins. Just going to jump ahead a little bit. This is typically where you hire someone who's a contortionist for, doing stuff like this, because it's going to be a lot easier. And this is more of the same stuff. So cutting to something like this, this here I'd assume is entirely digital. You got, some photo reference there, but this I assume is all painted. Otherwise, they might have shot that plate. This is definitely matte painting extension. I'd assume 3D could be just painted, one or the other. But you have those throwaway wide establishing shots. Then you got this, which looks so cool, and the reason is because it's all practical. The only thing that throws me off is we got this like really ugly wet cloth, which makes me like, this is the only thing I'm kind of confused about, is like, because I'm 100% sure that this is all practical. But that wetness it's very consistent with the other stuff, and I feel like that's not on purpose. I feel like maybe she's there's that, and they figured, we can just paint on that stuff. Like, that just, to me, does not look great, whereas, like, the rest of it looks awesome. So, apologies if whoever did that piece is watching, but it's just the kind of digital makeup on her I'm not a big fan of. Everything else about it looks great. But yeah, that's the general gist with this sequence, just kind of plowing through it very quickly, but I really love what has been done with the creature. To me, it's like one of my favorite pieces of the whole film is the whole design, the way it's animated, the whole system behind it is really cool. Okay, so I'm going to jump right into this. And I'm going to fast forward through a little bit of this, like, Venom in a reflection. That's not rocket science. Main thing is just making sure that you're able to pull a good track. So, keeping that in mind. This part here is like one of the first times I think we see any kind of transformation of Eddie Brock. There were a few earlier that are kind of very quick glimpses, and all of those are all comp. They're pretty basic, but something like this, again, it's just very similar stuff. You're just doing layering on elements of goo, having them as like a particle system or a spline, and having that have some kind of distance webbing. So again, I kind of feel like in general the way that this typically works, and again I could be wrong, but it's kind of like it fires out a ray around this point to figure out the distance. Like, when something like this comes along at a certain point, it's going to decide, okay, fire out webbing, and then obviously as it pulls back in, all of it retracts. So I'd assume that's more of like a spline or rope solver based system. Again, all of this is more how I would roughly approach this, more from a VFX soup standpoint. Obviously whoever's assigned to do it ends up spending weeks, sometimes months, figuring out the system, the workflow, the pipeline, and that's when you get into the nitty gritty. So it's more just me kind of firing out, like, in general, this is what I assume would need to be done, and obviously you're just doing wire work for all of that. I like all the gooey stuff. It's it isn't too complicated. I hate the sequence. It's my least favorite thing in the whole film. Is like, let's go and do Venom as Eddie Brock riding a motorcycle with a bunch of drones that kamikaze crash into him and explode into blue flame. I don't know. There's just so many reasons why I'm just not a big fan of this. But I get that they're trying to show off Venom without just doing the full Monty right away. So kind of like slowly introducing him. So it's like a good way to do that. Again, like, if you were to look at this stuff, it's, the basic kind of interaction again, like in the free Venom training that I was doing, a lot of it you would have like a surface and you would emit this kind of crawl particle system that would crawl over the surface from that center point, and then you would have something like kind of launch out from there. And that crawl area that kind of like webs out over the body, again, it's all Venom, so it's all black, it all feels like one body, but this is a way that you would have it all attach, is having the kind of implicit surfacing all kind of tie together, so that all this webbing, all this crawling outward is, rather than just having, something coming out of nothing, it just kind of helps make it feel like it's part of the body and it's all kind of being pulled together and extruded out. So that's typically how, I imagine a lot of this is done. Most of this, I assume, is all in camera. It's all stunt work. Obviously, he's, a lot of green screen. And then, CG being layered on top for all this stuff. So, is what it is. I'm guessing that all the explosions that you see are a combination of some are practical, some are CG, just depending on how crazy they are. But, yeah, I mean, it's nothing I would really comment on as being, too interesting. It's stuff that you see all the time. So, like I said, I'm going to fast forward through a lot of this, but I feel like in general it's just, him on a green screen for the most part, and occasionally, get some crazy shots like this. Again, it's just going to be green screen, CG bike. That's all wire work. I do think coming up here there's some CG, like digital double stuff, but just in general, it's all pretty straightforward. Yeah, I think. Sorry, I'm just jumping through this really quickly. Yeah, digital double stuff there, and then obviously stunt guy there. So here, I'd imagine it's just the talent lying on the ground, and then the broken leg is just a digital leg. And then obviously it warps all into place. I like what they did there, combination of either... I assume this is 3D. You could totally do it with just morphing for this here, but I'm assuming that's all 3D. But then you can see here, I think it kind of just blends into a uncut model afterwards. So I think there's kind of like a lot of cheating happening in 2D wherever possible, which is smart. Like, hack where you can. Like, I think it's suicide when you get 3D people or studios in general trying to overcomplicate shots for no reason. Again, this is a good example on more of like a macro level where you're seeing all the webbing and everything, because usually we're seeing it in much more larger scale, like the symbiote, stuff like that. So it's kind of rare that you'll see it at this smaller scale where you can see all the intricate detail kind of webbing all over his hand. It's kind of cool. And this is obviously like one of the more famous shots from the trailer. Again, you can see this is all just metaball kind of particles as it's all kind of coming together. If you pictured Maya, you'd have like goal weights, like all the particles are all just kind of moving to their set position. And then, yeah, so it's pretty cool. The transformation, so I put out this free training in November, and it's 5 videos going through all the stuff. And it's been a lot of fun doing that. And one of the biggest requests was always the transformation. Not particularly this one, but at the very end of the movie. But this is another example of it. So that's been like one of the biggest requests. And that was actually something I instantly thought, okay, what am I going to do that's Venom? Because I originally asked for everyone to vote for what they want to see, and everyone said, I want to see Venom. So the goal was always in November, I'm going to make some training around Venom. And that was a lot of fun to do, but for months I was just thinking like, all right, November's coming up, what am I going to do? And I couldn't really wrap my head around what to do for Venom, because there's a bunch of stuff that I thought would be really cool to do, but it would be just way too much work. It would be, the budget would be 30 grand or something to shoot it all, and yeah, it was just going to be kind of crazy. So one of the big ones though was the transformation. Like that's what everyone kept requesting as well, and I thought it made sense for me, like, that is something we could do. But the thing is that this whole transformation isn't it isn't really effects. Like there are a lot of effects in there, but a lot of this from like a discipline standpoint is more character rigging. So a lot of this I mentioned before is like wrap deformers. Like you essentially would have a pretty intricate setup where you might pretend these are kind of bones in a way, but you're basically deforming this head around this as it wraps over the head. So a lot of this is more to do with deforming the Venom model to kind of wrap around his head, which turned out great. Like, I really like what they've done. But it's not effects. Like, if we were to do this, it would be a lot more rigging. It would be a lot more morph targets and wrap deformers. There is effects, and in the hero shot at the very end, which is the main trailer shot, there's a lot of comp work as well. There's a lot of cheating, blending, and masking and stuff like that. But in general, there's like texture maps. I say textures, but obviously this is more really nice shader work going on. Like, I like what they're doing. So if I say textures, I'm more kind of talking about like a lot more complicated shaders than just textures. But I like what they've got going on. And then on top of that, you'll see like there'll be a fluid sim that kind of drips down over the face. So again, like I like all the intricate layers underneath. And then of course you have like the hood kind of wrap over the face, so you get the whole Venom look to it. So, like I said, it's not effects per se. It's more having, you got the fluid coming down, you got the veins, and then you have this kind of hoodie kind of being pulled over his face. But it works. And I really love the eyes. Like, that's one thing that I just didn't have time to really get into, is doing like, a lot of shader work in here. But I really like the subsurface scattering on the eyes. Like, to me, that really sells the character, because I don't feel like a lot of this is really too overly complicated, and it doesn't need to be. And that's the thing about, like, I think the shaders, the lighting, everything really works. And so in terms of creature work, it's not overly complicated, but it works. It looks good. So it's a given that you're going to do a lot of CG draw, and that's something that we did in the training. I put out the videos, like put a whole lesson together for doing draw. I wanted to go overboard with it, but again, I knew that in the time frame we had, we could only go so far. But I actually had built a system. I never actually got to show it, but having all the draw between the teeth, which was really fun, and then I also had all this draw kind of pocketing down in between the teeth to get like just really nice kind of areas of draw coming out of the mouth. So I thought that was kind of fun. Doing something like that, but the sim times were getting really steep, whereas like all the draw that we did on the tongue, it wasn't so bad, having it drip down, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, the stuff in between the teeth like really made the shot, as well as having stuff stuck between the top and the bottom gums. But again, it was just getting really heavy to sim, so I left it out. But that sort of stuff is like really fun to do, and it's the kind of secondary stuff that you don't see too often, but it can really, the subtleties can really make the shot. I feel like in a lot of ways, the draw, especially the interaction layer on him, you could have made it a lot more visible. And I get that maybe it's more of a director or a supervisor call to not make it as visible as it is. But, personally, I feel like you could play with the shaders more to get more visibility without it looking too hokey or too over the top. Because I feel like this was just so subtle. You don't appreciate like the awesomeness of it. So one thing that just happened there is they've got this bullet hit, and that's one thing, like you don't see too many of these in the film. And of course, there's no blood, stuff like that, which for effects can actually make your job harder for integration and interaction as well. The bullet hit here, I think it's important to bring this up because it's more of a story piece. There's going to be not a story piece, but more of a visual cue. So there's going to be certain times where like you might have him, his eye line is at this guy, you got this guy's head. So your whole entire focus is here. And it's such a quick shot that if you want to keep all these beats as you go through, having this guy get hit and even reacting a little bit and then cutting, it's going to be too quick to be able to see like all the whole pacing of the shot, of the sequence. So having a visual cue here, having that effect, instantly your eye shifts from this to, oh wait, what's that? And then you can segue into the next shot, and it all makes sense. So it's because it's so quick, having a visual cue like that is really important. And I say that because, again, I feel like effects, especially, is something that breaks down to a few different categories. A lot of effects artists, just like modelers and everyone else, like effects, it's very easy for artists to try and make their effects the star of the show. Like, hey, look at me, like the drool, for instance. I say, like, you could really go overboard with it, make it draw more attention to it. A lot of the times effects artists will really try and make their stuff like, really cool and really over the top. And subtlety can sometimes be the way to go, but that's the big balance, and that's the important part about effects and everything in CG. So it's the same thing that, like, effects can also be a storytelling device. It can be something that can be a visual cue to shift focus elsewhere or to segue to the next shot. There's a lot of different ways that effects can be really important, and rather than it being something that dominates the shot. And I feel like that's what a lot of the time effects do, is they over-dominate what's going on rather than it being, more of a storytelling piece. So having that there without that shot, he would kind of react and then be looking down. Like, it just wouldn't work as well. So it's a very subtle, simple thing. It's not complicated, but it's a necessary one that really kind of drives the attention of, like, hey, there's something off frame that's actually happening. Now, I like all this. I think they did a really good job. All these CG cars. Anything with a police car in it is great because you get this really cool lighting that tends to contaminate the rest of the shot. And I love anytime you got, like, cop cars, like with the sirens kind of just spinning around, because you gain that in the reflections on the other cars, on the walls. Everything is glass, so it's all reflective. So all of this really works really well. So I thought this all works great. I liked it. I like the shot where it's just you got the camera trucking back, and then it pans slowly 180 degrees, and then off into the background there. And you got a quick, splash sim, CG breakup over there, simulation there. That all works really well. So I thought they did a good job on that. This is really simple. You're just going to do kind of like a mist pass underneath. It doesn't really need to be much, just like atmosphere, something like that, like smoke. And then have a water shader on top just to distort the refraction, getting tongue-tied. And then you do the water sim and then foam sim in the background there. So pretty straightforward. It works. And then as he gets up, we've got the duo scene here. So he walks back over, and then the symbiote comes out of here. So one thing you'll notice is that it isn't bridging on him. It's, I think it's more of a framing thing, but, you'll notice that this is all happening away from him. You don't see it actually on him. It's more kind of a separate piece. And that, I think, is more, like I said, more of a narrative to kind of say, like, hey, this guy's his own thing. He's not, Eddie Brock's arm or anything like that. But yeah, it makes it definitely easier when he's completely off frame, where you don't see that connecting point. So I think that kind of makes it a little bit easier. In terms of this stuff, like, I would imagine that this is all geometry, whether it's procedurally built or what, but you've got all this geometry, being entwined and built out. Then you've got, like, particles or an animated displacement map shifting over it all. So I'm pretty sure all of this stuff, it's like if you had made it all UV coordinates, it's all just shifting up here. And I think it gets to around here, and then all of it kind of, like, piles up and starts to die out. So if you look at this part of the body, all of it's kind of moving up like that. But obviously that would be very distracting when you're working on the face. So I think from memory, I think all of this is kind of more just kind of undulating around a little bit, whereas all of this is definitely got that kind of shifting, as if it feels like it's all liquid or rushing upward. And I think it's just like, I'd assume like UVs set up where you got particles kind of following those UV lines, and it's just following along there and kind of shifting and moving along those surfaces. And again, you just have like that metaball implicit surface kind of doing all of that. And again, like maybe I'm wrong, maybe this is all just displacement. You could get away with either because it doesn't need to be particles to get that look. It's not like you've got any fluids dripping off or anything like that. So, you know, you go with what's more straightforward. But yeah, you can kind of see that if you look, all of this is kind of moving upward the whole time, but it kind of stops around the face. So again, you can see it's all flowing this way. But whereas here, it all kind of stops as it gets to the face because, again, you don't want too much stuff going on the face. You want to be able to read it and connect with it because, obviously, again, your focus is right here because you have the eye lines. Instinctively, we always follow eye lines. So if you ever see good marketing, you might be on a web page and you have some person here and they're staring at the buy button. So even though it's so subtle, the happy person holding a Coca-Cola is staring right down at that buy button, and you feel compelled to be like, what are they looking at? And it's the same thing here. We're always going to be focused on each other's eye lines. So having like crazy effects like everywhere is just going to, detach away from that. So that's why you have this clear out of frame thing here. And again, all of the busy motion all ends there. And that way the face is really readable. So yeah, I think this stuff works. Like, it is what it is. It follows the comics design. It's kind of cool, kind of creepy. Venom is such a weird movie. Anyway, it's just in terms of structure and everything else, it's very 90s in terms of how it's set up. So, like I said, I kind of blasted through the sequence, but I'm hoping that gave a little bit of indication about all this. Like I said, this is by far my least favorite sequence, so I kind of do want to skip ahead. I just hate the whole concept of Eddie on a motorbike doing really ridiculous stunts, showing off just a little bit of Venom to, do elaborate stuff here and there, and having these drones exploding kamikaze style into him in every turn. So that being said, we'll move on to the next sequence. Okay, so moving forward with this, this shot here, I'd imagine is all CG. It's just got Venom running up a wall. So again, you do the kind of ground hits. These are pretty common when you got like a character like smashing through something, just doing these quick setups that you can just have procedurally repeat. And then obviously these are all live action. I'm assuming that's a set piece, just because I think later we've got the talent in the shot, but obviously this is all CG. We've got a panoramic shot of the whole Bay Area. Pretty ominous, nicely lit. I like it. And I really like this. So I think, what is it? Yeah, it's a plane flying over to go to the San Francisco airport. And yeah, I thought it was really cool because I think that, again, this is one of those things that's more of like a procedural setup. You initially have Venom, and you just have this setup where it's just firing out displacement, like noisy displacement all over the body. And on top of that, you got these kind of little rope solver things kind of shooting out everywhere too. So just having something like that, and I'd imagine you could easily just plug that into a noise controller and let it go to town. But it's pretty awesome. Like it's simple in a lot of ways, but it works. Looks really cool. So I really like that whole sequence. Like just all the rope bits. I say rope because I'm assuming it's a rope solver, but all those splines coming off of it, as well as all the displacement and shader distortion that's going on. And yeah, all that I'm assuming is green screen. And good old CG hand, nothing too complicated. I fast forward a little bit to this. Now, I would imagine there's no glass in these frames at all. This is all green screen, office space setup. You've got these girders, what are these called? But anyway, the frames in here, and then I would just go and add CG glass so you get a slight reflection there. And then obviously this here, you would go and fracture it all and then do the dynamic sims. You have glass just like shatter everywhere. And then you would go and map out like 3D models of the table and everything else, just so that way all the glass kind of lands on top of that. So pretty straightforward, but you know, it works. I've done so much of this kind of stuff. Yeah, good and bad. I think Blade 3 was probably the worst I saw, where we had to have Blade in this this building up here, and he jumps out this little window, and the camera is looking up, and then he jumps down onto the ground in one shot. So then the camera is like tilting down. And I think this is basically an ode to Blade 2, where they Tippett did like a really cool shot. So we did this where it's like half of it was Blade jumping out onto like a cushion somewhere, and then the second half was him just kind of like landing on the ground, and we had to like morph in between the two and have glass coming down. It's you know, a really terrible shot. I'm sure it's out there somewhere. You know, you get some of those that are really terrible, then you get ones that are really awesome and fun to do, and something like this, just having like glass shatter, or, you know, for me it's more the environment, getting stuff to like break and interact with everything. That's always fun. So cutting straight into the SWAT section, this to me is like one of my favorite sequences. I think that a majority of it, I assume, is all live action, but it just works it works as a fun sequence in the movie, you know, opposed to the drones and the motorcycles, stuff like that. This is finally where they can show Venom in full force. You know, before it's like we can't really show Venom off because then everyone's seen it and we're only a third way into the movie. So instead it's like, let me just do arm extensions and, you know, just silly stuff like that. Whereas here, it's like, okay, finally, we're far enough into the film that we can actually just show Venom being a badass. And yeah, so I think this works really well. So here it says mask, and then you see here there's essentially it's like a texture map blending. So you have like this noise map that starts to spread. And again, very similar to what we were doing in the Venom training that I put out. You would have like this noise map kind of spread on, and as it spreads on, you can see that we have that the veins around the edges, which are in this case, I'm guessing another rope solver kind of thing, just like spreading out everywhere. But then we have that that texture map stuff I was talking about, the wet cotton stuff, which I'm not a big fan of. But this is such a quick shot; it works really well. It's just when you're in a brightly lit environment, and it comes on and it fades away, like in with the long-haired contortionist guy who dies at the beginning. That didn't work so well. So with this, again, it's just rigging. You can see that the hoodie, his face, it kind of like bends over, and then you see it going down there, and then you see there's a 3D match move head, again with the, you know, veiny texture map spreading over it, and then you can see there's liquid starting to spread over the body as well. So those, I think, are all the layers really that you get, but it works. And then like, all of that, it comes over, and then I'm assuming at that point all of it goes to like a set position, so it all kind of like tightens all up, and yeah, then it's basically full form. So here you can see we got bullet holes, things like that. Again, you don't see that too often. I think it's really just that one shot we're talking about, whereas over the shoulder, having that visual cue, that you really see it splatter. Whereas I don't think you really see it too much here. It's more just like a ripple. And I think that's just in general, it's just because it's PG-13. Now, I would have loved for this to be R-rated. I thought originally it was, and I'm like, hell yeah, it would have changed the tone if it was more like Logan and Deadpool, that sort of thing. But anyway, you can see that some of the stuff that I did in the training that I put out, like having the smoke grenade, all that kind of stuff there, that was more of an ode to that. There's so much more I wanted to do with it. Unfortunately, I hit like a rendering wall in terms of what I could get rendered in time, so there's a few limitations there. So in general, the smoke, I mean, it's kind of flat, but you know, I'm not going to pick it apart. I think that it works, and I'm not really going to pick smoke apart too much. In an evenly lit environment like this, I think it works pretty well. So all of this, it's obviously shot in anamorphic lenses. You get all these anamorphic lens flares everywhere. I think this stuff's beautiful. This is what I originally wanted to do myself. Just with the training I put out, I originally just wanted the focus to be everything was in haze, atmosphere, smoke, and other stuff like that. So we had all these like volumetric rays kind of from the flashlights, everything just peeking through it all. It would have been really cool, but like I said, kind of hit a bit of a render wall in terms of what we could get done. So all of this, again, entirely 3D. Then I'm assuming that there might be some smoke elements to kind of add and beef up the atmosphere, but in general, I'm assuming that all of this entirely live action, and you just got him kind of hazed out in all of it. And typically to do that, you're just going to put Venom in a fog cloud, like a natural just volumetric cube, just to kind of haze him out. Or you can do it entirely in comp, like in Nuke. If you're rendering him deep, you can then put 3D fog and put him in the middle. Coincidentally nicely named is Eddy, which is a volumetric fluid solver for Nuke. And I'm really interested to start playing with that more, because I think that a lot of this kind of stuff, you could do a 3D render of the character and just drop him into Nuke and do all the atmospherics directly in there. I think that would work really well. Some of these I'm assuming are actually, because again, like they're such quick camera pans, quick cuts for all this. I'd imagine some of it's wire work, and then there's stuff like this that you're going to have digital doubles, because there's too much going on to kind of choreograph this very easily. You'd previs it all, and then I think there's a lot of shots that you would green light just to do entirely CG. You might do a bunch of quick pans, stuff like that, but I would imagine that I would just get an HDRI or digitally build the set. Again, because it's half in haze anyway, there's a lot that you can get away with. In fact, I'm kind of curious if you look at the geometry, how complicated this stuff is. Just again, like all of this is digital. So yeah, you can kind of transition back and forth. I love all this stuff here. I thought that'd be really, I thought it'd be really cool to go through all this. Like whenever there's a flashbang, so I'm getting distracted. My Skype is flashing, so that's why I'm rambling or not making sense. So I like when there's a flashbang, he kind of gets displaced, and you see all these tendrils come out. Like, I thought that was really cool as a visual cue that you've got all these things happening around him, and it kind of builds and builds, and then you see him kind of, kind of take back control of it all. But he's kind of reactive to the whole thing when there's all these flashbangs going off all the time. So I thought this whole sequence was really smart. It worked really well, and it really kind of showed off Venom as a whole. Even like having those that framing, that kind of posture as he's like jumping down, like all this stuff works really well. So I feel like this is really who Venom is in this. Like this whole thing here is all CG. Whether the environment is like, I love the fact that in this day and age you can actually say, well, hey, I can't, off the, at first glance I can't really tell is the environment CG or not. It is very dull. It's very covered, but I like that we're at a point where Digimat works so effectively that it isn't obvious like, oh, that background CG. Like I remember seeing movies where I'd be on a date or something and I'd be pointing out like matte painting, just because they look so terrible, but these all hold up. So I think that's like such an important thing, is that we're at that point where all of this has come together so nicely that it's quite seamless. Like doing 3D, especially 3D in the 90s, so bad. 3D was never meant to look good, and these days like you can get away with so much. So yeah, all this really beautiful. I love all of that got done. I feel like that's all wire work. That's beautiful. I love all that. Cool. So again, kind of going through the sequence very quickly, but I feel like this is one of the most effective sequences where it's just like the gloves are off, no limitations. You can just go all out and do something really cool with this. So I thought, all of this worked so well, and having it all kind of covered in atmosphere and fog, that worked really well too, just because it means you got those contrasts of having lights, both red and blue, or blue-white, pushing through. Like the whole thing worked really well. It was very smart in terms of just making a really fun sequence to show all this off. So yeah, really love this. Really cool stuff. All right, so we'll move on to the next sequence. I know I'm playing through these pretty quickly, but hopefully you're getting a lot from it. Okay, so looking at this sequence here, I'm just going to, again, plow through this one too. Just starting out, though, we've got Eddie running through, and again, just masked. You know, you can see there, it just blatantly disappears bloop, off of his body. So, again, a lot of this is just comp, like, blending on and off, you know, a lot of CG elements. So, going through all this, I'm just going to go through it quickly, but you got the moment here where Riot grabs his arm. I really don't like the lighting on this personally, and again, I don't want to be mean, but every single time I see this shot, it's just, it feels very overlit, and I realize that you're in an office with a lot of artificial lighting, there's light sources everywhere, everything's reflective, but this just feels really overly reflective. And same thing there. So maybe this is part of the design, and if so, then you know I'm wrong. But yeah, it just, the whole thing kind of feels a little bit overlit. And yeah. Anyway, so I won't pick on it too much, but again, this is one of those shots that just, if it was R-rated, would have been completely different. Instead, it's just this PG-13, kind of like everyone disappears. So, again, okay, so I'm just going to go through this really quickly, but I like the sequence. It's just so tidy and neat. It's just a cute little sequence, and it works really well. So, again, I kind of feel like it's very different to the rest of them. It's much more slower paced than every single Venom sequence in the entire film. And because of that, even the effects, like, you get to actually appreciate some of what's going on. This guy is so short. But yeah, just the entire sequence is very differently paced to the rest of it, but it works really well. It's very comical. And it just lets you actually enjoy Venom instead of it being this, like, built up sequence that really needs to be kind of like intense. Instead, it's just like, all right, let's just have some fun. And I think it works really well. So there's nothing really new about any of this. I like the fact that, like, while you got the dialogue, like, the drool actually works really well. It's just kind of like, yeah, like, it just works really well in this sequence. So this is what I was talking about at the very beginning. So this is, I feel like, what a lot of people were requesting training-wise was the transformation here. And this, if I'm to go through it frame by frame, this, to me, I feel is a lot more cheating than all the others in terms of transformation. And it's also the one that's got the most screen time. So here, you can kind of see that there's a lot of liquid that spreads up, and I think that's how you transition, because this is a hard surface. This is all a rigged character. But then to make this transform, you emit particles over the entire surface, and that allows you to reveal underneath. So I feel like now there's like a layer that's all comp underneath of the actual character. All of this moves away. So all that's kind of particles. Basically, it's all kind of snaps away to that reveal, surface. It's kind of hard to explain, but it's exactly how we're doing in the training, where you emit particles on top of this hard surface that make it all feel as one. I guess, like, they've gone an extra step more than what our training did in the lessons, because you've got, like, the this vein layer as well. So we didn't have that, and we didn't really need it because we weren't up close. But you've emitted this particle surface, and that means that this could be a hard surface character. It's all rigged and animated, and then you have, like, these veiny things, and it's all part of the same surface, but it just kind of allows it to, emit over, and then all of this stuff emits into the gunk, and it feels like the whole thing is just kind of faded or ripped away, but it's really just, you got a particle layer that just all moved to the side into this kind of controlled thing, and then underneath, as we've seen before, we have all the veins. I don't think there's really any liquid per se in this one. It's more just like a lot of veins is in splines or displacement, and then actual veins here. I don't think, because it's such a slower shot and it needs to be very clean, there's no liquid, whereas the other shots had kind of like a liquid pouring down. But yeah, this works really well. It's just, again, it's all kind of set up, I think, with particles and things like that. And then obviously you've got an animated Venom, and then you have live action talent in the center. And then as it comes back down, it's a lot of cheating. Cheating, and cheating is good. There's nothing wrong with cheating. But yeah, it's just more the fluid kind of reverses back into place. You can see the teeth kind of just slide back in. Again, this isn't meant to be going through frame by frame, so I feel I would hate for people to be looking at my stuff like that. I love this shot. This is my favorite shot in the whole film. We were trying to do that in the training, just get like this really big biting shot. I love that he's kind of licking his teeth for a second. I love the saliva. The whole thing about it is just, it's perfect. I love it. So that is pretty much it. Again, like, I've had a lot of fun with this. I think this has been a really fun experiment. I wanted to, again, like, Venom wasn't really my choice to initially do this with. What I would like to do as a sequence is do things like really big visual effects films, usually with a bigger budget, do it that way. Because Venom is such a weird film in terms of, it feels like more of like a 90s structured film, with all the Marvel films and everything else, like, where a lot of films have kind of figured out the pacing and what works. This kind of breaks all that and goes back a little bit. I keep thinking of that motorcycle sequence, but it's very much a different film. I feel like the visual effects, there's a lot of them. They're not really too overcomplicated. I feel like Black Panther had a similar thing where I think it was mostly method. A few other studios worked on that, but like, I feel like Black Panther had really great effects, but I think that they were very carefully created with the intent of repetition, mass population, and not being necessarily too overly complicated. I think there's, it's kind of like you selectively choose, like, these sequences are going to have so many effects. We'll keep them very simple. We'll build assets for a lot of it, and we'll be able to populate them and get them out very quick. And it frees up the schedule to really focus on a couple of sequences and really go overboard and put all your attention there. And again, I think that's really smart management and organizing when it comes to really supervising that project. Here, I kind of feel like it's the same thing as I mentioned before. It feels like a lot of what's been done has been a couple of very senior people have gone and built very complex setups and made sure they're all working, built that out as a tool. And this is very common for a lot of big studios anyway, but then from there, I feel like that's been handed over to sequence leads who have a team of 50, 100 people who've got stuff to do, and they're using those tools just over and over and over. And that happens all the time, but I do feel like there's been a lot of shots where it's like, maybe you have that set up and it needs to do something a little bit more specific, and unfortunately the person operating those shots doesn't know how to do that themselves. Therefore they rely on that tool, which without having someone who really knows how to bend it and shape it how they want, isn't going to be able to get those results. So I feel like there's a lot of that, where there's a lot of shots that are like 80% of where they could have been. And it sucks to see, because I think that most of this was executed really well. It's just, I feel like some things were like 2 versions off of being finaled when they got finaled. Again, everything they're saying here, like, this is me more looking at it from that 30,000 foot view. Okay, so usually as a VFX soup, you might read a script and kind of figure out, like, roughly, like, okay, like, I think that we're going to go about it this way, and I'll budget this many days and a few extra in the margin just in case it becomes a lot more complicated than we expect. But that's just it. Like, I'm looking at this in hindsight, and also from the finished product more as a concept. So in other words, I don't know the specifics. Like, I'm more talking about how I think, if I was supervising it, how I would be doing it. But I wasn't in the trenches doing it. I don't have that know-how necessarily. So some of the stuff that I talk about where I'm like, oh, I don't feel like this was done very well. Every sequence every project has a story, and there's sometimes creative decisions that get made by the director or a studio exec in some cases, like on Superman, when they decided to take Superman's cape away in one version of Superman Returns when I was working on that, so he couldn't fly. Just random stuff that gets said. So, I mean, you never know what the backstory is, and sometimes where, something doesn't look quite right, it's because it wasn't the artist's fault, it's the creative decision that someone higher up has said. So I always want to say that because I feel like out of every project, Venom is probably not the ideal one for me to pick, just because it's very easy to pick apart a lot of stuff, especially when you're going frame by frame, which, again, I don't want to do, but in this case, I kind of felt it necessary because there's a lot of transitions from live action to CG and, just in general. So that's the main thing. It's just, I'm more excited to kind of jump onto some things that I think would be really fun to talk about. But at the same time, I wanted to talk about Venom first, just because it's the theme that I'm going through right now. I've been putting out a lot of training around Venom, and I wanted to put this out too. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you got a lot from it. This was a lot of fun to do. And that being said, I'm going to leave it there. Like I said before, I'm going to be doing a lot more of these if you find them valuable. So let me know. Leave a comment below and tell me what you think. If there is things that you want to add, like things that you want to see covered. More importantly, if there's film projects that you want to see covered in here. So in other words, if you want to see the Harry Potter series, whatever it might be, let me know. I would love to get ideas as to what you want to do next. I'm always open to feedback because I want to do what you want to see rather than me assume what would be best for you. That being said, if you can share this, that would mean the world to me. Again, this is something that's brand new that I want to consistently put out, and I think it'd be really valuable for others to benefit from it. I know I'm really grateful when people share stuff with me. I'm like, yes, that rocks. Like, that was something I didn't know about before, and I'm always going to think that person is putting me in contact with that content. So again, sharing is caring. I hope that you're able to do that and make someone else's day. But more importantly, let me know what you think of this stuff. And yeah, I'm going to be doing more of this. Now, finally, if you want to sign up, I guess, to my Inner Circle email list, like I said, I put out a lot of free training. I also put out several new guides, specifically more around us as creatives, us as artists working in the film industry, how to negotiate money, how to set up our career, how to break into the industry, even at later ages. If you're 30, 40 years old and you still want to get in, a lot of us think that is too late. So I've written a book specifically on that. There's a lot of guides, free courses, free content, email templates I use to apply for jobs and to negotiate money, all that good stuff. So I've an unlimited amount of resources I've been constantly putting out with myself and my team. I hope you found this valuable. Like I said, if you can subscribe, if you can share, leave a comment, let me know what you think of this stuff, and more importantly, what movies you want to see next. I appreciate you, and I appreciate you taking the time to go through this, and I hope you found this valuable. I'll be back with the next visual effects case study soon.